with us. Happy New Year. And as we enter 17, we are entering with an opportunity for fresh perspective, an opportunity to take a breath and to imagine what it looks like to join God in healing our broken world. And as we think about our engagement, as specifically speaking of the U.S. American Church, we have a heart to see our influence as a constructive, transformative instrument of peace in our world. And so for us at Global Immersion, we have been engaged in Israel-Palestine now for years. We've been leading delegations to Israel-Palestine to actually go learn from our peacemaking friends embedded in the midst of this conflict. And it's been unbelievably transformative. Global Immersion is a peacemaking training organization whose mission is to see the U.S. American Church activated an instrument of peace. And when we are in the center of global conflicts like Israel-Palestine, we are actually shaped and transformed in ways that impact the way we live and love and lead back home in our communities. And so for us as U.S. Americans, understanding our influence, we have an opportunity to enter into the complexities of global conflicts, not in the posture of heroes, but in the posture of learners. And this webinar is another one of those opportunities for us. My name is John Huggins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion, founded it with Jared Swigert about 6 years ago. And our team is committed to creating spaces like this, like through these webinars, hear the perspectives that often aren't displayed in our mainstream headlines and news outlets, that we want to give access to this seemingly innocent conflict so we can actually have the eyes to see a more nuanced and robust perspective on things. And we're not looking necessarily to agree on everything, but we are looking to listen well. We're looking to get curious, and we're looking to offer not only ourselves, but our communities and our country a more whole picture of the way we understand ourselves and our global family. And so if there's something we've learned about the opportunity of these webinars, is it's a moment where we can actually stop hearing about certain people or about certain places and start hearing from them. One of our mentors and guides actually in Israel-Palestine offered us that advice recently when we were talking to him about the reality of Islamophobia in our country. And he, as a Muslim himself, said, you have to start learning from us rather than learning about us. And this is an opportunity for us to learn from those engaged in this Israel-Palestine conflict, those on the ground and those engaged from the U.S. And as we do this, we understand that this is an incredibly divisive and polarizing issue and conflict for many people. And it has been, and I would say largely the U.S. American Church hasn't done well at hosting these kinds of conversations. And for us, we are going to host this conversation in a posture of civility and curiosity. And so each one of you actually have the opportunity to drop questions to our panelists in real time as you're hearing them talk. You're welcome to put questions in the chat box. We ask that you understand that this is part of our peacemaking formation to actually ask genuine questions, not ask leading questions, to be civil, to hold harsh critique for personal interactions rather than online engagements, if it's ever appropriate at all. And so be thinking of that as you engage the chat thread. We'll do our best to get to some of your questions if we have time. Finally, why are we hosting a webinar on Israel-Palestine and specifically this resolution? And we understand that this issue is incredibly complex, but we also understand that the United States and the church is marbled into this reality. There's no way to dissect the engagement of the U.S. American Church and the conflict in Israel-Palestine. And for us, we see this as an opportunity for deeper engagement that can be constructive, that can begin to build a better future for our friends in Israel and Palestine, or it can be an opportunity for us to widen the divides that already exist. And so our hope in this space is to create an opportunity for us as U.S. American Christians to engage this reality, and specific as this hit the headlines last week in really bold ways, for us to have a full perspective that moves us towards engaging as instruments of peace. Our friend Dayoud Nasser is a Christian Palestinian, and he often tells us when we're there with learning delegations, he says, if U.S. Christians lived like the Jesus they follow, the world would be a different place. And we actually believe that very significantly, that we are called to follow an others-oriented, enemy-loving God who we see embodied in Jesus, and that requires that we move towards conflict constructively and transformatively. In regards to how we as an organization engage this conflict, I'll mention a little bit at the end, but I want us to jump into this. And one last note before I introduce our first panelist, Greg Khalil, is in this conversation, we are not claiming by any means to have the answers to the extremely complex reality that is Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then specifically this UN resolution. And we aren't even claiming to be offering all the perspectives represented of Israelis and Palestinians and US-American engagement on this call. We're just giving one window, even though it's multiple voices, one window into a very complex reality. So don't see this as us claiming to be the end all, but this is an opportunity to listen, to learn, to grow in our understanding of this conflict and our role within it. So our panelists, who I'm thrilled are with us today, range a variety of perspectives and worldviews and geographic locations. We have Greg Khalil, who is the president and co-founder of Telos, which is an organization we respect and have a lot of mutual work in Israel-Palestine. They're largely leading the way in U.S.-American engagement, Christian engagement of Israel-Palestine. We have Liel, who has been a dear friend. He lives in Israel. He's Israeli co-director of Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information. His journey as an Israeli and as one who served his mandatory service in the IDF, and the way it's moved him towards constructive peace-building efforts is remarkable. Thrilled that he's with us. We may have Ali Abu Wad with some technical difficulties, so we'll hope he jumps in here in a little bit. He's a Palestinian activist and pacifist. He teaches principles of nonviolent resistance to Palestinian men, women, and children, and is a member of the Bereaved Families Forum, and is doing incredible work between Palestinian villagers and those in the Israeli settlements. John Moyle is a dear friend. He's a pastor of missions and social justice at Oak Brook Church, and he has been engaged relationally in Israel-Palestine for years. He's been a dynamic bridge builder between those in settlements and local villagers, and some of the work that's come out of that has helped us humanize both the settlement community and the Palestinian community in ways that are incredibly helpful, so have a really unique perspective. And finally, Kathy co-pastor at the Refuge, and she's the author of Faith Shift, and she's a dynamic voice who represents U.S. American Christians who are actually seeking to constructively engage this conflict and see it as actually an opportunity of formation and discipleship for her community. So she's going to help us ground this larger conversation and what does this mean for us as everyday Christians in America. So let me go back up to the top. Greg, open it up with you. If you would help us just give us a foundation and understanding of this UN Security Council resolution on Israeli settlements that the U.S. abstained from. If you would guide us into what actually that was made up of, describe some ranges of reactions and why people had those reactions and what might be the implications of this going forward.
Sure, John. First, Happy New Year, everybody, and thanks for the invitation, and apologies in advance because I have to jump off this call relatively soon. So I'll try to be brief and give an overview. One footnote first, a little bit more background on me. So Telos promotes what we call a pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace perspective in America. Co-founder of that, we're 8 years old in January. Previously, just so you know, I was a lawyer and I advised Palestinian leadership on negotiations with Israel. And I do have some personal connections to the conflict. So my dad was born and raised just outside of Bethlehem. So I want you to know that so you can sort of position my commentary, even though I'm going to do my best to give an objective overview here. So first question, John, you asked, I think, was a little bit more about sort of, UN 2334, the Security Council resolution that just passed last week, and Kerry's subsequent speech. Well, the resolution itself dealt with one of the most complicated issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically what most of the world refers to as Israeli settlements. So first, what's an Israeli settlement? Settlements are Jewish Israeli communities that are built outside of what is recognized as the state of Israel and what many people refer to as the West Bank, what the Israeli government calls Judea and Samaria, biblical terms for the territory known as the West Bank. I'll give you a very simple analogy. I'm in San Diego right now. It would be as if there were a war, and this is a very cartoonish analogy. I know a lot of people will have problems with it, but for those of you who are just sort of entering this discussion, I want to start at a very basic level. If there were a war between the US and Mexico came in and moved its army into San Diego here and started building Mexican communities here in San Diego that weren't part of Mexico officially, and those would be sort of the equivalent of Mexican settlements. So I know, very simple analogy, but according to international law, long history of the United Nations, settlements are considered illegal. And this has been a real sticking stone in the conflict. The international community for a long time has said the resolution to this conflict, which it agrees with, but consensus among states has been it needs to be a two-state solution. So there would be the state of Israel along with a future state of Palestine, and that Palestinian state would exist primarily on the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So if you're building all of these Israeli towns here, where is that second state going to appear? So there's this political dimension to it as well. So not only are these settlements considered illegal, they're also considered obstacles to achieving what many have long believed to be the only resolution to this conflict, which is a two-state solution, Israel-Palestine, peace, security, side by side. Now, one thing I want to highlight here just about the settlements before going on to sort of a few words on Kerry's speech and the reaction is, many people will ask sort of why, and particularly for many Israelis, they'll say, wait a second, this is the birthplace of Judaism. Why is it that somebody who's Jewish can buy a plot of land in New York State or in Argentina, but they can't build in the place that's most significant to Jewish history, which is the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And so that's a real issue for many on the Israeli side and many supporters of Israel, and there's a lot of differentiation there, as we're going to hear from our Israeli friend. But the issue with the settlements doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity or religion per se, specifically to Israeli settlements. It's rooted in a fundamental principle of international law, which is that there is an absolute prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force. That means, in essence, that you can't go and take somebody else's land and claim that it's yours. And if you do, other nations around the world have a right to respond, and they also have an obligation not to recognize it. So, for example, going back to my silly analogy of Mexico invading the US, if Mexico did come into San Diego and say, hey, this was Mexico a couple hundred years ago, we're going to start building Mexican towns there, we claim this is Mexico, whatnot, the world could respond in a variety of ways, but every nation around the world, because of that absolute prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force, would have a duty not to recognize that reality. And that's explicitly what this UN resolution rooted itself in, is a long history within the United Nations of dealing with this particular conflict and trying to sort of, protect that fundamental principle of international law. Now, the resolution also did talk about Palestinian terrorism, incitement, and that's something also Secretary Kerry focused on, but I think most observers would agree the sort of primary import of the resolution and Secretary Kerry's speech had to do with the settlements and the preservation of the two-state solution. So Kerry gave this interesting speech after that, which I think many of you saw. It was well over an hour long, and there were a variety of reactions to the speech, ranging from, hey, too little, too late, like, where were you over these last 8 years? President Obama, Secretary Kerry, as the settlements continue to expand. Now we're entering a new administration. We're not sure how the Trump administration, is going to deal with this conflict, but many people are some of his than the Obama administration, and one more favorable settlement, Obama, at least rhetorically. But then there's Israelis who, Israelis, there's a complicated 1947 General Assembly recommended the two-state solution of historic Palestine, land of Jews, into two sections, one Arab. And for many is sort of the foundation story of the modern nation state of Israel, which was born in 1948. And yet the United Nations has taken up the question of Israel-Palestine in a variety of different ways consistently over the past years, in a variety of different organs of the United Nations, and many Israelis feel that they have been unfairly singled out as opposed to other parts of the world by the United Nations, by the same body that kind of blessed the birth of the state of Israel. Now, Palestinians, on the other hand, have felt that they have nothing. They don't control the land that they live on. They don't have rights within their own state. They don't have a state right now. There isn't a state of Palestine in the truest sense of the word, although a majority of UN member states have recognized the existence of the state of Palestine. But if you're Palestinian and if you're living in Palestine, if you're in the West Bank, Gaza today, the territories are separated. You can't get in or out of the territories because the Israeli military is there, the occupying army, primarily in the West Bank and also around the Gaza Strip in coordination with Egypt. So it's a complicated situation on the ground. And for Palestinians who don't have much control over their lives, they often will refer to international law and the fact that the United Nations has consistently said that settlements are illegal and the occupation is a temporary condition that must end. So what Kerry was doing in his speech is he was trying to emphasize the necessity of finding a resolution to this conflict and saying that the two-state solution is the only solution, and the fact that Israel is continuing to build these settlements is not the only reason why we have not found a solution to this conflict, but the settlements will prejudge and preclude any possibility of establishing a two-state solution, whatever you think about the two-state solution. That was his argument. It was very, very clear. And he told very personal stories about his connection and his love for Israel. And he also referenced, I think it's the first time I've ever heard an international an American leader talk about the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. That's sort of the Palestinian narrative around the founding of Israel, because for them it meant the birth of the refugee crisis, dispossession from their homes, sort of this ongoing struggle to have some kind of place in the world and some measure of dignity and freedom and justice. So he tried to tell these different stories. The big thing that he did in his speech—
Greg, we got about 1 minute, just so you know.
Was to lay out a vision for how to implement a two-state solution. And he laid out 6 principles for how to do that, which, don't worry, I won't go through. The bigger question here, and I'll end with this, is what does this mean? What are the range of the reactions here? Why is this important? Well, I think one, timing is important. Obviously, this happened at the end of Obama's presidency going into the new Trump administration. And this administration, I think it's fair to speculate, feels that the question of a two-state solution is now a serious question that the world needs to respond to. And second, I think what you're going to see is you're seeing an opening for an internationalization of responses to this. So there was that was said in this resolution that hasn't been said hundreds of times. I think what was new was the way that it was said, and then also sort of Secretary Kerry's clear call to many nations around the world to engage this conflict differently. So what does that mean? I think you'll see historically the US played a role sort of as a protector of Israel. That's how it perceived itself, as because of the close relationship between the United States and Israel. And that's controversial, I think, among many on this call, but as a protector of Israel and Israeli interests in international fora. After this resolution, I think it's more likely that you'll see other states take different postures towards the settlements within the UN or on their own, and that may spark some discourse, changes in discourse. What are those changes in discourse? I'll close with this. I think, we've heard a lot in the media about sort of boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel or Israeli settlements. That movement and other economic measures will probably gain some steam within civil society, as will sort of anti-BDS moves, which are quite common here within America. For those Americans, there's a lot of uncertainty going forward, so it's impossible to tell if there'll be any sort of major consequences for the conflict itself. But what we are seeing is a real entrenchment of positions, along with renewed energy in both camps going forward. So it's an interesting moment in the history of this conflict, John.
So good, thank you, Greg. And I think that. Even as we hear Greg talk, we realize that not only is this reality complex, but it requires that we become students ourselves, that we have to become students of conflicts before we begin to grab sound bites and then just project those on our own behalf. It's not helpful. It doesn't actually humanize and serve a constructing ends for our friends in Israel, Palestine, on either side of this issue. So Greg, your word is huge. It's helpful. We're going to follow up with some resources for all those of you that are listening that registered for this, with some reading that can help point to more of what Greg is talking about through a variety of different news outlets. So thank you, Greg, for your contribution here. Liel, I want to move to you. And now in moving to Liel, we're moving across the world to Israel. And as an Israeli yourself, and you're hearing Greg unpack his interpretation of this resolution, specifically for those of us on the West looking to Israel-Palestine, you are a leader within the community in Israel as well, and a bridge builder between Israel and Palestine. Would love to hear your perspective of what's the general sentiment of this resolution specific to the Israeli settlements from Israelis in the range from left to right. What fears does it bring up? What hopes does it bring up? And then how does that impact you personally in your work?
Okay, thank you very much, John and Greg, for your introduction. It is always great to be involved in discussions of the Global Immersion project, and I will be very happy to be involved in more. I would like to start with the general sentiment about the resolution, and maybe then we can try to criticize it, or I'll present my personal view of the organization. Look, although Israel was established after the UN resolution of 1947, for decades the Israeli government delegitimizes foreign critique on its policies, and especially the UN in general. This approach was intensified over the last decade under the administration of Netanyahu, although himself he was the ambassador at the UN in the 1980s. This delegitimization of the UN is built on three arguments. One is that there is a majority, a definite, clear, regular majority against Israel, which is biased and is anti-Semite in some way. People in Israel are discussing the idea of a majority of non-democracies in the UN that are regularly voting against Israel, but are not voting against the others. There is also foreign critique from Europe that when it's being presented in Israel, immediately it's being presented as anti-Semite critique, something that is rooted with the idea of criticizing Jews in general, and not something that is unbiased or neutral towards Israel. Another approach of Israel is that the conflict, or whatever happens beyond 67 border, is an Israeli issue. It's an internal issue that the Israeli government need to decide upon, maybe in negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but it's not an international issue. And thus, every international critique or even international involvement is being perceived as illegal international involvement of countries in the issues that like countries need to solve internally within themselves. This is also the argument that is behind the regulations that try to limit the support of foreign governments on human rights organizations in Israel or pro-Palestinian organization in general, which those regulations were promoted and adopted by the Israeli government over the last years. According to this approach, the UN resolution in general was delegitimized by the government and by the media that really presented only the governmental approach without any other ideas that tries to show something that is more creative. Generally, about the resolution, the media and the Israeli government said that it's one-sided, although it's not, as Greg said. It puts on all the blame on Israel. It's one-sided. It proves that the UN is corrupted. It proves that the regular majority is dealing only with Israel and not with other issues. Some people said that even the UN is addicted to criticize Israel without dealing with other issues. Other journalists or writers said that while there is a massacre in Syria, the UN condemns Israel and not adopts a resolution that that is dealing more with something that is more urgent. And of course, there is also the point that Greg presented, which is about the betrayal of the US, which the Israeli ambassador to the UN and also the ambassador to the United States said that the American government kind of didn't do what was expected as the friend. It should have kept the critique internally in the relationship between friends and not going out there in the UN, where Israel is supposed to have to be defended by the American government. Of course, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, said that the face of Obama was exposed, that the Israeli government is facing this critique internally for years, and finally the whole world knows, and especially the Jewish community in the US, what Israel is facing for years and what is the true face of Obama, that of course for many years it's being presented here as extremely anti-Israel, even sometimes pro-Palestinian, pro-Muslim, or anti-Semite. And all this critique was related to the resolution. We at IPCRI, and me personally, I must say that I don't see the resolution as anti-Israeli or anti-Israel in general, but maybe pro-Israeli. It secures the idea of the borders that were secured after the 1948 war. It distinguishes between the settlements and Israel. It presents specific policies that the Israeli government should adopt in order to secure its borders, to secure a Jewish state, and to secure a two-state solution, while showing a specific policy that should be stopped, which is the expansion of the settlements. I must also say that the resolution, I think, is pro-peace, not only pro-Israeli, and it's pro-peace because it gives some blame to both sides. It discusses the incitement in the Palestinian side, it discusses some violence together with the settlements, and it gives a general declaration that there is an opportunity here for peace. We just need to stop doing these specific actions that undermine the peace process. And when you specify the specific actions that need to be stopped, it means that you believe generally that the peace can be achieved if those actions will be stopped. I think in general, also that because the UN resolution demands a regular monitoring of the UN on the settlements, it can put more pressure on Israel to stop with this action and maybe to bring us a step closer to peace, which for many years now it's being seen as far away or too far for us to reach. I must say that I'm sorry that it was too late. I'm sorry that this resolution wasn't adopted beforehand, so the Obama administration could have promoted other policies according to it, or even negotiations according to this general map. I would like also to say that we need to remember that when we condemn settlements, and this is something the resolution is not presenting clearly, or the general critique in the world against the settlement is not presenting clearly. When we are criticizing the settlements, we should remember that we should also make a distinction between the settlements, which is an Israeli policy that undermines peace, and the settlers that are living in the settlements, and sometimes they have strong connections with Palestinians and can present creative ideas for the future that were not discussed beforehand. The people that are living there are not to blame, and the Israeli governmental policies is what should be at the center. And this is something we should remember.
That's a really, really helpful distinction, Liel. And actually, we're gonna dive deeper into that with John here in a second. But let me ask one more question, because you just offered us a really helpful, widened view of some of the sentiments in Israel in general, and then specific to you. Are you seeing, in light of this resolution, a growing divide between those that affirm it and those that are critiquing it, even in Israel? You know, in the U.S., it's a very politically partisan moment right now for us. What's it like in Israel in light of this resolution? How is that impacting the way you're interacting as Israelis?
I must say that the reactions are very diverse. Like, you can see people on the left, which left in Israel basically means criticizing the settlements or are for stopping the expansion of settlements or supporting of two-state solution. In the left, some people say that the resolution and the speech of the Secretary of State was too late, and thus it's insignificant. Especially when the Trump administration will start, everything will be canceled in some way. There are other people on the left that say that finally, although we are in this post-truth era, finally the truth is on the table. It was covered or hidden for many years. People adopted this politically correct discourse towards Israel without specifying the problem with the expansion of settlements. And finally, the truth is on the table. Everyone is discussing it. And if we can see the American media over the last week, we see a lot more representation of Palestinians and their narrative. So the speech and also the resolution brought to the center something that was marginalized for a long time. On the right wing, on the other hand, because they are in power, I must say that they kind of try to reassure their arguments by saying that this is a proof that the Obama administration was anti-Israel. We should continue the expansion of settlements because then we can force a different reality on the ground. The right wing is also many times saying that the settlements should have the same destiny as Tel Aviv, which is on the shore, but because Tel Aviv was built on Palestinian villages, some of Tel Aviv was built on Palestinian villages in 1948. So if the settlers need to go back, also Tel Avivians need to leave their houses. And by this, they kind of try to delete the green line that was established in 48, and by this to cancel the UN resolution by saying it's fully anti the Zionist movement in general.
Yeah. Liel, thank you for that perspective. Again, Liel, co-director of Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information. We have more information about his work and organization online, and it will be in our follow-up email as well. Thanks so much for your contribution. Some of the questions that are coming in are really, really good. And Liel, if you'd hang on to them to call if we have some time, I'd love to lob some of these back to you. With that being said, I want to move to John Moyle. And we talk about, in our peacemaking framework, the importance of building uncommon or unlikely friendships. And that to be a peacemaker is to move towards people that look, think, act, believe differently than you do. It's not a compromise of our faith. It's a reflection of the very best of it. And John is someone who does that in really tangible ways and has done that specifically with those living in settlements and Palestinian villagers outside and nearby the settlements. And so some of these uncommon friendships have led to some fascinating perspective that we get to learn from today. So John, I want to hand this to you now, specifically in light of what Liel mentioned, the distinction between the settlement as a governmental policy and the settler as a human being. Help us destigmatize some of the, we have narratives like the settler is the Zionist hero who is restoring the land. From another perspective, they're a violent militant who is taking the land. There's all sorts of different ways to think about this community. If you would zero us into the reality of your experience and the relationships you built there.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, John, and thanks, Jer, and the Global Immersion Project for having me. I really appreciate it. About 6 years ago, I began to journey to the Holy Land to start building relationships with those who were living on the ground. I first went to learn more about the conflict, to understand it better. But the more time I spent, I realized the less that I knew. I realized that I needed to sit down with people and to listen, to shut my mouth and to listen and to learn. Because much of what we get in the West is not really the reality that is taking place on the ground. And I found this by spending time with both Palestinians, villagers, and those who live in the larger cities, and as well with Jewish settlers who live in the different settlements. I should say about the Jewish settlement communities in the West Bank, this is not like a monolithic block. There are several different, if you will, varieties of settlers. There are economic settlers, those who are living there because it's cheaper to live there. Folks just can't live in the suburbs of Jerusalem, for example, and make ends meet. And so they move into the settlements. There are two large ultra-Orthodox blocks, or I should say settlements as well, Modin Elit and Beitar Elit. But the vast majority are what I would call national religious or Orthodox Jews, and who are there because they believe that they are part of a miraculous move by God who's brought the Jews back to their land, back to their roots, that they've come back home. That 2,000 years ago, they were unjustly evicted, exiled from the land by the Romans, and that for 2,000 years, they had been praying and longing to come back to Jerusalem. They believe that they are part of this incredible move of God, and they believe that every part of the Holy Land is important. Every part of Israel belongs, is part of what should be the restored Israel. And so especially the villages and towns, different places in the West Bank are extremely important to them. For example, there are places like Beit El and Shiloh and Tekoa, Shechem, Hebron, just a variety of places that have very Kiryat Arba, very deep biblical ties, and these places are the most important to them. And so they couldn't imagine an Israel without these places being a part of that Israel. I mentioned you need to spend a lot of time listening and learning. And as I began to listen and learn, these settlers, for the most part, feel that the world is against them, that the world is against what they believe in, and that they don't understand that they are people coming back to their home that was taken from them. They feel like they've been branded or made to be colonizers, that they're building colonies much as the West would, or the West did in Africa and other places in the past. And so they feel very misunderstood. They are people who definitely love God. I'm motivated by my love for Jesus to go and to try to be a peacemaker there. And so what I have learned very quickly is I've connected with the people who very much love God. And it is their desire to do his will. And so that is their motivating force, the thing that drives them to continue to live in that land. Now, while I'm with them, though, I'm constantly looking for the jewels. When I mean the jewels, I'm looking for those people who, in the middle of their narrative, they also recognize that there's another narrative out there, that there's a narrative of the Palestinians that's very different than their narrative, and that they recognize narrative, take into account the narrative of others, and recognize that there has to be some kind of future made and built that includes both narratives, in which both peoples, Palestinians and Jews, can achieve and come into all of their greatest aspirations, that it's a win-win for both people, that's the only way a true shalom can be created. So I'm looking for these types of folks who are willing to step across the divide, to sit down with Palestinians, to build close relationships, and to learn to not just to respect or to tolerate the other, but even to admire the other, to come into that place of seeing the humanity of the other and recognizing that what needs to happen is that instead of greater separation needs to take place, the greater integration of the peoples needs to take place. And that ultimately true peace and true shalom will come when everyone's getting what they desire, as opposed to asking people to give up those things that they hold dear in trying to compromise and come up with a peace. I would, just to say a couple things, when you come into close relationship with people, then and only then do you have the grounds, the place to be able to speak into their lives. Only then do you have an opportunity to share your heart from an outsider's point of view and to encourage others. So for example, it's through relationship with Orthodox Jews that I can encourage them to rise up into the best of their faith tradition, that they would be a people of mishpat, of justice, of tzedakah, righteousness, of shalom, peace, of rachmaim, compassion, emunah, faithfulness, chesed, loving kindness. That these things urge them to be those people, and so that they can truly then light for the Gentiles and light for the nations, which the Bible is calling them into. So relationship is everything. John mentioned this uncommon friendships. I think without them, peacemaking becomes a board game of Risk, where you're just moving pieces around, you're drawing borders on a map, but you're not taking into account the true ideals, the passions, the needs of the individual people on the ground. If these aren't addressed, then any solution that's ultimately decided upon by the international powers, these problems are still going to exist. These issues are still going to be there, and it's a potential powder keg ready to blow. I would maybe just add here before closing, this resolution to the Orthodox Jewish settlers, to them, they hold it in great disdain because it doesn't take into account any of their aspirations. It doesn't take into account their desire to be able to live in the places like Bethel and Shiloh and Tekoa. It completely ignores that desire, that need, and is in essence saying that, well, the border has to be someplace else because of the geopolitical and strategic realities. That's not good enough for them. That's ignoring their desires and their needs, and that has to be addressed if there's ever going to be a true peace. By and large, this resolution on the ground in the West Bank, it's old news already. It's old news because it just doesn't meet them where they're at. Right now, there's more talk in the West Bank about annexation, the discussion about annexation, possibly of the settlement blocks or of Area C, that gets more airtime and more discussion than the resolution ultimately in the West Bank. And so I just will close by saying that it's extremely important that every people group involved in a conflict is involved in the coming up with a solution. You can't say, well, the settlers, they're radical, they're the problem, the settlements are the problem, therefore we're going to make decisions outside of them or away from them. They have to be included. If the ultimate peace is going to be worth the paper it's written on, they have to be included. And that's what I'm trying to help do by building relationships and get people talking, Palestinians and Jewish settlers together. Just, the unity and trying to voice something on the region as being something that's going to have any success in the long run.
John, thank you. That's a really, really helpful and necessary perspective here. As we have navigated relationships there on the ground, specifically those in settlements and around them, a common sentiment has been, pursuing a political peace is one thing and it can be helpful, but true peace has to happen in a relationship. That ultimately a political peace is a piece of paper. In the end, people have to build conciliation, healing themselves, and otherwise we might be under the same peace accord, but it doesn't mean we're interacting anymore. It doesn't mean that the brokenness of past pain has been healed. And so I hear you saying that, and I hear those of us that could easily write off a community as those that are an obstacle to peace. We have to listen there in the same way that we have to listen to other perspectives in the past that often we're taught not to hear. So thanks for giving us that perspective. A bunch more great questions came in. And I want to acknowledge them because they're the right kinds of questions. They're the curious questions. They're informative. And Liel, if you're around written, that would be great. If they're related to you, John, specifically Matt Moberg's question would be one that if you could jump into, that'd be really helpful. Liel, I think you've got a few going. I want to move to Kathy Escobar, who, one of the questions just came up. This is often empowered. How in the world, in the U.S., kinds of relationships that impact our global mobility? And one of the ways we talk is the world is coming to us in large part, that via refugee resettlement agencies in our cities, or just the diversifying reality of our world, the way we live locally impacts positively or negatively our global family. And Kathy's one who's living that out very tangibly in Colorado with her faith community, who we've been with before. And so, Kathy, I want to ask you the question: how, here's this Israel-Palestine conflict that can be a wedge within churches, and I see you walking with your community and seeing it as an opportunity for your formation and your discipleship. How has that unfolded for you? Can you walk us into that process, and what's the constructive way to engage this conflict beyond just the UN resolution conversation, but this conflict in general as a Christian community?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's great being with everybody. And every time I'm in any of these conversations, there's just so much to learn. And I really think that that's how we engaged as a community from the beginning, is just entering as learners. And it did kind of start for me, I'll be honest. I was just an average evangelical Christian. Coming from that, that's really always Israel and the Christian church be completely merged together. And so I just grew, that was the strain that I grew in. So I didn't really know anything except for the story that I heard. And that story was a different story than what I experienced when I went and visited for the first time in 2013. And I really respect in this conversation, you can't go. It did break things open for me because I came with a really open mind, not really knowing. It was a trip with my mom. My mom is half Jewish. I'm a quarter Jewish. It was a bucket to go in a particular way. And having an experience where we were in the refugee camps, then we were in a settlement. We had voices from all sides. This particular trip was very balanced in terms of hearing the perspectives from the different sides. And when that happened to me, and the work that I have been doing for so long, working in the margins, our community is really dedicated to people on the margins. It was like all the worlds merged, and I realized something that is so important, and that is we really just listen to only what we've been fed. We don't, it's narrow, and realize that there's a much wider story. And that is why, I mean, you've alluded to it, and so has everybody. Relationship changes everything. Stories change everything. So on the ground, for people listening, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things is that, what do I do as an American Christian? How do I respond? What does it mean to be a peacemaker? And I think it really starts with learning. I just didn't know. And so I came home and just started reading, started talking. I got involved in an interfaith group here in Denver that has been really transforming, to just show up with a wide variety of people representing different faiths, and especially the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith and the Christian faith together. There's other faiths there also, but to begin to listen to them, to get to know them as friends and get to hear their perspectives. And so that part has just been eye-opening. I was able to go back and bring a group back a couple of years ago now. And one of the things that is, every person that went was kind of in the same boat. We prepared for a year. So we just began reading, and everybody in that group would say almost the same thing. It's like you couldn't really believe it all the way, because we had been, a certain narrative had been taught to us in the stream of Christianity that we were used to. And the news, I mean, there's all kinds of things. A lot of people get their news from Facebook. Depends on Facebook. It sounds so silly, but it's not silly. Those things kind of come into us, and we assume they're true. And so seeing, and my husband was on that second trip with me, and some other friends they went in as skeptics, really, to the story that I had come back with. And then when they heard the story, their reality, things changed for them too. So I found the biggest piece, and what is so challenging on one level, but also so beautiful, is just to hear stories, to be active learners. That's what we're called to as Christian disciples. We're called to an attitude of humility and not knowing, and being willing to learn. And that's really hard on this kind of, I was sort of, we knew, and it was clear that God was on a certain side, and that works. And, that's what true Christians believe. And so having a bended knee, rereading the Beatitudes over and over and over again, and kind of reflecting on not what they mean just personally. I was always taught that it was kind of a personal attitude, but reading them from a wider, more communal, as Christians, what do the Beatitudes mean? It changed this conversation, because we're talking a whole bunch of people on the underside of a big amount of power. And I understand it's so complicated. And every time I hear the other speakers share, we realize how tangled up so many things are. And I think it is really important to have a balanced perspective, to listen to all sides. But the truth is that most of us have only heard one side in a lot of our Christian churches, because that's just kind of the stream and the assumption. And so getting to know Palestinians, getting to know people who worked with Palestinians, the Refuge, the faith community that I co-pastor, we've hosted multiple conversations. We call them learning parties, ways for people to come, learn, ask the dumb questions. On this one, it is really hard, because a lot of times the conversation's way up here in a place that average people don't, can't pick apart and make sense of. And people want to ask the kind of, I'm embarrassed to ask it, but I need to ask it questions and get answers on the ground. And so those conversations have been so helpful. Each one, every time I'm challenged and learn, I think every single person who has come has always left with the sense that I really didn't know that. And so, my long, windy road there is that it always comes to the stories. And I think one of the questions, I can't remember who asked it on the Q&A thread, but it can feel so disempowering on this side I can't go to the Holy Land. I can't go into a camp. I can't go into a settlement. I can't become friends with somebody there. What do I do here? And I would just say, start the conversation somewhere with somebody. And that's why I love the Global Immersion Project and people that I know that are working on peacemaking, because you guys create a place for people to learn. And that's probably the number one thing that I think is our starting place, is to bend our knee, to open our hearts, and to sit at the table and listen and really kind of break out of assumptions of the things that we've been taught.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Kathy. And I think that, and why I think your point there matters so much is it's not just specific to Israel, Palestine. Like if we're talking about following Jesus, getting on a knee and listening and learning is a posture we all need to take, and especially in today's world that is filled with so much volatile rhetoric that is actually beginning to sow more seeds of division than ones of healing. And we're not sitting around tables with people that we need to be sitting around tables with. And, we often say that the table is the most important piece of furniture in the kingdom of God. And if there's stuff that's getting in the way of us sharing a table with people who look or think or act or believe differently than we do, then we're missing out on some of the most sacred work that God has in store for us. So thanks for modeling that in your community, for these suggestions. I think when I hear you say, have learning parties, host conversations, build relationships, some really tangible, we'll follow up with some resources on content that could help you guide those learning parties. A couple books that are really good introductions with your specifically your Christian communities, Christian churches. One's called Blood Brothers, is a great narrative that really invites you into the human story of what's going on in Israel, Palestine. Another one is Embracing Israel, Palestine by Rabbi Michael Lerner. It's a great resource. Dale Hansen Burke has another great primer that kind of has a general overview of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So there's a few books to put on your bookshelf, read yourself, and then invite people, as Kathy said, into a learning party that actually shows that we're willing to identify the blind spots in our own lives. Because if there's anything we realize, especially in a conversation like this, when you're hearing perspectives like Liel's and Greg's and John's, and then Kathy as an integrative way forward, we all have blind spots. It's just a matter of us acknowledging that they exist. And when we don't enter into relationships that shine a light on those blind spots can do a lot of damage to people that we are called to care for. And if there's anything we've found, it's that our flourishing with our friends in Israel, Palestine is interdependent with ours, with their, like, we have to see that my flourishing is directly connected to their flourishing. And I don't know how many conversations I've had with my Jewish Israeli friends or my Muslim and Christian Palestinian friends, where I've been able to identify the way that I think theologically and politically and act locally and internationally has tangible implications on them. And if I'm in a relationship with them, I have to change the way I behave and the way my community behaves, and be to join in a movement that actually is seeing specifically the church, for those of us in the Christian community, as an instrument of peace in our world. So a couple of resources going forward that we would that we would offer. One, we're going to follow up with this webinar with an email. It's going to have a recording of this, so you're going to be able to capture this 1 hour, and you can. We would suggest having a viewing party yourself, a learning party, with people that need to hear these perspectives that weren't able to attend. So you'll get that recording in the next few days. We'll have some key resources that'll help guide you deeper into the conversation of this UN resolution, and also just some starter resources for engaging Israel-Palestine in general. For us as a peacemaking training organization, one of the ways we train for the work of peacemaking is to actually go to the center of this conflict of Israel-Palestine. We spend about 8 days on the ground there. Before we're on the ground, we have 2 months of learning with the online class. We call that whole experience a learning lab, and we have one coming up in May. The trip will be May 7th to 14th, and you're welcome to sign up on the website, register for that, and join us and actually have these firsthand encounters with people on the ground that are way off the beaten path of tourism. If you're interested in learning how to crack open this conversation, a very hard conversation in your church or your community, feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to offer some coaching on how to do that. We understand that it's a journey for many, and we want to be with you in that. Lastly, I would say follow up with these folks that spoke today. All their information and the organizations are on the website and will be in the follow-up email. Send them a note of encouragement for the work they're doing, that a gratitude for guiding us deeper into a nuanced conversation here. And in the end, I would just I would encourage each one of you to pay attention to the stuff that came up in this conversation that was disruptive. Even as you're listening to a perspective, there's something growing you that's seeding anger or frustration or disagreement. Pay attention to that. What's the seed of that? Where's that coming from? And maybe it's coming from a healthy place. Maybe it's another blind spot that we need to have a light shined on to confront and confess and repent of, that actually moves us towards the other in the way that we see Jesus modeling for us. And so let me offer a prayer and a benediction as we go to our panelists. All of you friends, thank you so much again. Grateful for each one of your work and witness. So as we often say, may we listen longer than feels comfortable. May we be a people who seek to understand rather than to be understood. May we be a people who see our flourishing directly connected to the flourishing of those on the other side of the world, specifically in Israel, Palestine. And may we not feel forced to choose a political side, but embrace the invitation to be pro-people as we navigate our complex world. So grace and peace be with you as we go. Happy New Year. Thanks for joining this webinar.